The laboratory is cold, not the kind of cold that comes from Moscow's bitter winter air seeping through cracked window panes, but the deliberate, sterile cold of a place where life and death are measured in heartbeats and breaths per minute. It is 1940, and in a dim Soviet research facility on the outskirts of the capital, a group of men in white coats prepare for an experiment that will challenge every boundary of medical ethics known to humanity. On the metal table before them lies something that shouldn't be alive, yet responds to light. A severed dog's head, isolated from its body, connected by tubes and wires to a machine that hums with mechanical precision. The head's eyes follow movement. Its tongue reacts to bitter substances. When a hammer strikes the table, the ears twitch. This is not science fiction. This is not propaganda. This is documented Soviet science, and the man responsible for this grotesque miracle stands calmly at the controls of his creation, watching his life's work validate everything he believed about the boundary between life and death. His name is Sergei Brukhonenko, and history would remember him as either a visionary who saved millions or a monster who violated the sanctity of death itself. Perhaps he was both. To understand how Soviet science arrived at this moment, you must first understand the Soviet Union's relationship with mortality. In the years following the Bolshevik Revolution, the new communist state didn't just seek to reshape society and economics. It sought to conquer nature itself. Death was viewed not as an inevitable biological conclusion, but as a problem to be solved through the relentless application of science and ideology. If man could reshape nations, why couldn't man reshape the fundamental laws of existence? Joseph Stalin's USSR became a crucible of extreme experimentation. While the West pursued scientific advancement within ethical frameworks established over centuries, Soviet researchers operated under different rules. The state demanded results. The party required demonstrations of superiority over capitalist science. And in this atmosphere of pressure and possibility, certain scientists found themselves free to ask questions that their Western counterparts wouldn't dare whisper. The obsession extended to the highest levels. Stalin himself was terrified of death, consulting with numerous doctors, demanding they find ways to extend his life indefinitely. The Soviet leadership poured resources into biological research facilities, creating a network of laboratories where scientists worked on everything from agricultural improvement to military medicine to the darkest corners of experimental biology. In this environment, the line between healing and horror became dangerously blurred. Sergei Sergeyevich Brukhonenko was born into this world of revolutionary fervor in 1890. He came of age as the old Russian Empire collapsed and the new Soviet state emerged from blood and chaos. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were swept into political movements or military service, Brukhonenko was drawn to medicine with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He graduated from Moscow University's medical faculty in 1914, just as Europe plunged into the catastrophe of the First World War. The war changed him. Working as a military surgeon, Brukhonenko watched thousands of young men die from wounds that seemed survivable. Soldiers bled out on operating tables not because their injuries were necessarily fatal, but because the human body's circulatory system would fail before doctors could repair the damage. He watched hearts stop. He watched brains die from lack of oxygen. And he began to ask a question that would consume the rest of his career. What if the heart could be bypassed? What if blood could be pumped and oxygenated by something external to the body, giving surgeons time to work, giving damaged organs time to heal? This wasn't mere curiosity. This was the driving question of thoracic surgery in the early 20th century. Heart surgery was essentially impossible because the moment you opened the chest cavity and disturbed the heart's function, the patient would die within minutes. The brain, that most delicate and irreplaceable organ, could survive only 4 to 6 minutes without oxygenated blood before suffering irreversible damage. This was the fundamental barrier that kept the human heart untouchable, mysterious, and ultimately beyond the reach of the surgeon's knife. Brukhonenko became fixated on this problem. After the war, he joined the Institute of Experimental Physiology and Therapy in Moscow, where he began working on what he called artificial circulation. His colleagues remembered him as quiet, methodical, and utterly dedicated. He would spend 18-hour days in his laboratory, surrounded by tubes, pumps, and the bodies of dogs that served as his experimental subjects. He barely slept. He rarely spoke of anything except his work. And slowly, year by year, he built something that had never existed before. By 1926, he had a prototype. He called it the Autojektor, a name that sounds almost playful until you understand what it did. The machine consisted of two mechanical pumps connected by a system of tubes and valves. One pump would draw deoxygenated blood from the subject's veins, while the other would push oxygenated blood back into the arteries. Between the pumps sat a chamber where the blood passed through oxygen-rich solution, mimicking the function of the lungs. The entire apparatus sat on a metal cart, powered by an electric motor that generated a rhythmic mechanical pulse, an artificial heartbeat. The Autojektor was primitive by modern standards. It was bulky, prone to mechanical failure, and required constant monitoring. But it worked. In controlled laboratory conditions, Brukhonenko could keep an isolated organ alive outside the body. He could maintain an animal's brain function while the heart was stopped. He had created, in essence, the world's first functional heart-lung machine, decades before such devices would become standard equipment in hospitals worldwide. His early experiments were methodical and relatively conservative. He started with isolated organs, dog hearts kept beating in glass chambers, lungs that continued to expand and contract while disconnected from any living body. These were remarkable achievements in their own right, pushing the boundaries of what was understood about organ viability and the nature of life itself. But Brukhonenko wasn't satisfied with keeping organs alive. He wanted to bring them back from death. The first major demonstration came in 1928. Before an audience of Soviet scientists and party officials, Brukhonenko took a dog, stopped its heart through controlled exsanguination, draining its blood until clinical death occurred, and then connected the animal to the Autojektor. For 10 minutes, the dog was dead by every meaningful medical definition. No heartbeat, no respiration, no brain activity. Then Brukhonenko activated his machine. Oxygenated blood began flowing through the dog's body once more. And after several minutes of mechanical circulation, something extraordinary happened. The heart began to beat again on its own. The dog's chest began to rise and fall. Its eyes opened. Within an hour, the animal was standing, albeit unsteadily, and responding to stimuli. The scientists in attendance were stunned. The party officials were thrilled. Here was proof of Soviet scientific supremacy, a demonstration that the new socialist system could achieve what capitalist science hadn't dared attempt. Brukhonenko was celebrated, given additional funding, and encouraged to push further. So he did. Between 1928 and 1940, Brukhonenko refined his technique and expanded his experiments. He successfully revived dogs that had been clinically dead for up to 30 minutes. He kept isolated dog heads alive for hours, demonstrating that consciousness, or something that resembled consciousness, could exist independently of the body. His laboratory became a strange theater where the boundaries of death were tested and violated with mechanical precision. But it was the 1940 demonstration that would cement his reputation and haunt his legacy. Filmed by Soviet cinematographers and later distributed as propaganda, the experiment was designed to prove definitively that the brain could function in total isolation from the body, sustained only by Brukhonenko's artificial circulation. The preparation was surgical and exact. A dog was anesthetized and its head was severed at the third cervical vertebra. The major blood vessels, the carotid arteries and jugular veins, were immediately connected to the Autojektor. The machine's pumps began their work, pushing oxygenated blood into the brain while removing waste products. The head, now completely separated from its body, was placed on a metal tray, surrounded by monitoring equipment. What happened next was recorded on film and remains one of the most disturbing pieces of scientific documentation from the Soviet era. The dog's eyes, which had been closed, slowly opened. When a light was shined directly into them, the pupils constricted. When scientists made loud noises near the head, the ears moved in response. Most disturbingly, when citric acid was placed on the tongue, the head grimaced and the facial muscles contracted in what appeared to be an expression of distaste. The head appeared to be alive, conscious, experiencing sensation despite having no body, no lungs, no heart. Nothing but a brain kept functional by mechanical circulation. The experiment lasted for several hours before the tissues began to deteriorate and brain function ceased. The footage was shown in scientific conferences across the Soviet Union, presented as evidence of communist scientific achievement. Here was proof, the propaganda declared, that Soviet medicine had transcended the natural order, that the socialist system produced scientists capable of challenging death itself. The reaction in the West was swift and visceral. When rumors and eventually footage of Brukhonenko's experiments reached Europe and America, medical ethicists were horrified. Questions erupted across scientific journals and medical societies. Had the dog's head been conscious? Had it experienced suffering? What gave anyone the right to create such a state of existence? The experiments were condemned as barbaric, unethical, violations of the fundamental principles that should govern scientific research. But buried beneath the moral outrage was an uncomfortable truth that Western scientists couldn't quite ignore. Brukhonenko's work, however disturbing, had demonstrated something profoundly important. He had proven that the brain could survive on mechanical circulation alone. He had shown that the heart, traditionally viewed as the seat of life, was in many ways just another pump that could be replaced by machinery. His autojector was crude, and his experiments were ethically dubious. But he had opened a door that would change medicine forever. The timing of his research wasn't coincidental. As Europe descended into World War II and the Soviet Union prepared for the inevitable German invasion, military interest in Brukhonenko's work intensified. The Red Army's medical corps saw immediate practical applications. Soldiers died on battlefields not just from trauma, but from shock, blood loss, and organ failure that occurred minutes or hours after injury. If circulation could be maintained artificially, if the dying process could be interrupted and reversed, Soviet military medicine could save thousands of soldiers who would otherwise be lost. Brukhonenko received direct military funding to develop field versions of the Autojektor. The goal was to create portable units that could be deployed to field hospitals, allowing surgeons to work on soldiers who would otherwise die during surgery. The research became classified. Foreign scientists who had previously received updates on his work suddenly found themselves cut off from information. The line between medical research and military weapon development dissolved entirely. At the same time, Soviet intelligence was well aware that similar research was occurring in Nazi Germany. German doctors were conducting their own experiments on circulation, hypothermia, and resuscitation, often using concentration camp prisoners as unwilling subjects. The race wasn't just about scientific prestige anymore. It was about military advantage, about which side could keep its soldiers alive longer, about which ideology could demonstrate superiority over death itself. Brukhonenko never spoke publicly about the ethical implications of his work. Whether he experienced doubt, whether he lay awake at night thinking about the consciousness he had isolated and trapped in severed heads, whether he questioned the path his curiosity had taken him down, these questions have no documented answers. He continued his research throughout the war, training other Soviet surgeons in the use of artificial circulation, refining his techniques, pushing always toward the goal of practical, reliable mechanical heart support. The war years took their toll. Resources became scarce, even for military priority research. Some of Brukhonenko's equipment was destroyed in German bombing raids on Moscow. Students and assistants were conscripted into military service. But the work continued, driven by necessity and by the momentum of Brukhonenko's obsession. By 1945, he had successfully used artificial circulation to keep wounded soldiers alive during lengthy operations that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. Lives were saved, techniques were developed that would eventually become standard practice. After the war, as the Soviet Union rebuilt and the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, Brukhonenko's research took on a new significance. The propaganda value of his work became even more important than its practical applications. Soviet science needed to demonstrate superiority over the West in every field, and Brukhonenko's heart-lung machine was tangible proof of communist achievement. He was awarded the Order of Lenin in 1965, celebrated as a hero of Soviet medicine, and his techniques were taught to a new generation of surgeons. But the ethical questions never disappeared. They lingered in the background of every medical conference, every discussion of his legacy. Had the price been worth paying? The dogs that were revived and re-killed, the severed heads kept alive for hours, the countless animals that suffered in the name of progress, did the lives eventually saved justify the suffering inflicted? There's no comfortable answer. Western surgeons who condemned Brukhonenko's methods would eventually use similar techniques to perform the first open-heart surgeries. The heart-lung, machines that allowed surgeons to stop the heart, repair it, and restart it. Machines that have saved millions of lives, all trace their lineage back to the crude Autojektor built in a Soviet laboratory. The ethical foundation of modern medicine, with its emphasis on informed consent and minimal suffering, was strengthened precisely because of the reaction against experiments like Brukhonenko's. The man himself died in 1960, relatively unknown outside medical circles, his most controversial work still classified or hidden in Soviet archives. He never achieved the international fame of other pioneering surgeons. His name doesn't appear in most histories of cardiac surgery, but his influence permeates every modern operating room where a heart-lung machine maintains a patient's life while surgeons work. The film footage of the severed dog's head still exists, archived in medical libraries, occasionally shown in documentaries about the history of medicine. It remains deeply disturbing to watch. The mechanical precision of the experiment makes it worse somehow. There's no cruelty visible, no obvious malice, just scientific method applied to a question that perhaps shouldn't have been asked in that particular way. The dog's eyes opening, the ears moving, the grimace in response to acid. These images capture something fundamental about the horror and promise of medical science pushed to its absolute limits. We live today in a world shaped by choices made in laboratories like Brukhonenko's. Every person saved by open-heart surgery, every transplant patient kept alive on bypass machines, every emergency room resuscitation, all of these carry the genetic code of those Soviet experiments. We have inherited the knowledge without inheriting the cost, or perhaps we've simply chosen to forget the price that was paid. Modern medical ethics exist precisely because of men like Sergei Brukhonenko. We developed rules about animal testing, protocols for human experimentation, institutional review boards, and informed consent procedures because we looked at what was possible and decided collectively that not everything possible should be pursued. The line between healing and harm, between extending life and violating the dignity of living things, is drawn in response to those who crossed it. But the fundamental question Brukhonenko pursued remains unanswered. Where exactly is the boundary between life and death? If a brain functions but has no body, is that life? If a heart can be stopped and restarted, when exactly does death occur? Modern medicine has moved the boundary repeatedly, pushing it further and further back. Patients who would have been declared dead decades ago are now routinely saved. The moment of death has become increasingly difficult to define, not because of philosophy, but because of machines that can maintain circulation, oxygenation, and even limited brain function long after the body has ceased to function on its own. Every code blue, in every hospital, every CPR attempt, every ventilator supporting a patient's breathing, is a small echo of Brukhonenko's work. We have normalized what was once unthinkable. We routinely stop hearts during surgery, knowing we can restart them. We keep brains alive on machines when bodies have failed. We have become comfortable with a level of intervention that would have seemed like dark magic to previous generations. The severed dog's head, grimacing at bitter tastes in a Soviet laboratory, represents both the triumph and the terror of modern medicine. It showed us what was possible, and in doing so, forced us to decide what was permissible. Brukhonenko believed he was conquering death. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps he was simply discovering that death isn't a single moment, but a process, and that process can be interrupted, extended, manipulated, but never truly defeated. Today, somewhere in a hospital, a surgeon makes an incision into a human chest. The heart-lung machine beside the operating table begins its rhythmic pumping. Blood is diverted away from the heart, circulated through mechanical lungs, oxygenated, and returned to the body. The heart stops beating. Time expands. The surgeon's hands move carefully, precisely, repairing damage that would have been fatal in any previous era. And when the work is complete, when the sutures are placed and the repairs are made, the machine is gradually withdrawn. The heart fills with blood. It trembles. And then, responding to some signal we still don't fully understand, it begins to beat again. That patient will wake up never knowing about the experiments conducted in Moscow decades ago, never seeing the film footage of a dog's head responding to stimuli while completely severed from its body, never hearing the name Sergei Brukhonenko. But they will live because someone, somewhere, long ago, asked a question that shouldn't have been asked and pursued an answer at a cost that shouldn't have been paid. This is the inheritance of modern medicine. Knowledge purchased with suffering, progress built on violation, life extended through the manipulation of death itself. We are all living in the world that Brukhonenko helped create, every heartbeat maintained by a machine, every moment of life extended beyond its natural boundary, every time we blur the line between alive and dead. We are continuing the work that began in that cold Soviet laboratory. We have made the choice to use this knowledge, to accept the benefits while trying to forget the origins. Perhaps that's necessary, perhaps that's the only way forward. But late at night, in research hospitals and medical schools, in ethics committees and philosophy departments, the questions persist. When we maintain life artificially, are we healing or just postponing the inevitable? When we revive the dead, are we restoring them or creating something new and troubling? Where is the line, and who decides when it has been crossed? Sergei Brukhonenko never answered these questions. He just showed us they needed to be asked. And in the decades since, as medical technology has grown exponentially more sophisticated, those questions have only become more urgent and more impossible to answer. The machine hums, the heart beats, the line between life and death blurs a little more. And somewhere in the vast network of cause and effect that connects past to present, the ghost of a Soviet scientist watches his primitive invention echo through time, becoming more sophisticated, more accepted, more essential, but never quite escaping the shadow of that severed head, eyes open, responding to a world it should not have been able to perceive. This is our inheritance. This is the price of progress. This is what it means to wage war against death itself.